For more than 12 years, Pattiya Phillips and Yeandle kept finding their way back to each other. They survived distance, breakups, arguments, an international move, family tension, financial disagreements, and the enormous pressure of putting their private relationship on television. Earlier this year, they were still telling 90-Day Fiancé viewers that they were together, still engaged, and still trying to make their relationship work. Then, almost overnight, everything changed. Pattiya announced that the relationship was over. But that announcement created an even bigger shock than the breakup itself, because Dylan says he did not know Pattiya was ending their relationship before she told the world online. According to Dylan, he learned that his 12-year relationship had ended by seeing the announcement publicly, just like everyone else. He described himself as blindsided and said there was much more to the story than what had initially been revealed. And that is where this story becomes much more complicated than another reality TV breakup. Because Pattiya says she reached a point where the emotional toll of long distance, uncertainty, and repeatedly being together and apart had become too much. She says she waited 12 years for the relationship to truly move forward and eventually decided that she needed to choose her own peace and happiness. Dylan, however, appears to see the situation very differently. He says the breakup was not something he wanted, and he has suggested that viewers have not heard the entire story. So tonight, we're going to slow the story down. We're going back through the relationship, the move to Tasmania, the engagement, the tell-all, the return to America, the financial disagreements, the tension surrounding Dylan's mother, the accusations and trust issues that played out on television, the surprising update that they were still together earlier this year, and finally the stunning August 2026 announcement that brought this 12-year relationship crashing down. And most importantly, we are going to separate what has actually been confirmed from what remains allegation, interpretation, or unanswered question. Because when a relationship ends publicly after 12 years, the most important question is not simply, who broke up with whom? The real question is this: how did two people who were still publicly presenting themselves as a couple only months ago reach a point where one says the relationship was over, while the other says he never even saw it coming? That is the story we are examining. To understand why this breakup has generated so much attention among 90-Day Fiancé viewers, you have to understand that Pattiya Phillips and Yeandle were never a typical reality TV couple. Their relationship had already existed for years before cameras arrived. Viewers first encountered the pair during Season 7 of 90-Day Fiancé, The Other Way, where their story centered around a fundamental question familiar to the franchise. Could an established relationship survive when one partner had to leave everything familiar behind and build a new life in another country? Pattiya was an American from Texas. Dylan was from Tasmania, Australia. They had a significant age difference, with reports identifying Pattiya as roughly 20 years older than Dylan during the show's run. More importantly, however, was the length of their relationship. They had been together for approximately 12 years. That detail matters. This was not a couple who met online 3 months before filming. This was not a whirlwind romance where two people barely knew each other before deciding to take an enormous international risk. They had already experienced years of love, separation, reconciliation, and uncertainty. In other words, by the time The Other Way began documenting their story, the question was no longer whether they had feelings for each other. The question was whether those feelings could finally translate into a sustainable life together. That distinction became critical. According to coverage of their story, Pattiya and Dylan originally met while working as performers in Las Vegas. Dylan had also appeared on Australia's Got Talent and worked with the Las Vegas entertainment group Thunder from Down Under. The couple's relationship eventually became long distance, and reports described the relationship as having periods when they broke up and later reconciled. That history is important because Pattiya's eventual breakup statement repeatedly focused on something she had apparently been experiencing for years: uncertainty. She did not frame the breakup as a single explosive event. She described it as the result of accumulated emotional exhaustion. And that may be one of the most important clues in understanding what happened. When people look at a breakup from the outside, especially on reality television, They often search for one dramatic moment, one argument, one betrayal, one text message, one accusation, one person walking away. But long relationships frequently do not end because of one isolated incident. Sometimes they end because the same unresolved problems keep returning, again and again, and again. That pattern appears to have been central to Pattiya and Dylan's relationship. For Pattiya, moving to Tasmania was supposed to represent a major step forward. After years of being together and apart, she was finally attempting to build a permanent life with Dylan. But international relocation is not simply a romantic gesture. It changes nearly everything. Your home changes, your social circle changes, your routines change, your financial situation can change, your independence can change, and sometimes the person you love becomes the person with whom you are suddenly spending nearly every hour of every day. That can reveal differences that were easier to ignore when the relationship was long distance. And that is essentially what happened with Pattiya and Dylan. Before the move, they could maintain a relationship across borders. After the move, they had to build an actual household and make actual decisions. That meant deciding where they would live, how they would work, how they would manage money, how they would deal with family, and what each person expected from the other. The show highlighted several areas of tension. One involved Dylan's relationship with his mother, Jo. Pattiya struggled with the degree of closeness between Dylan and his mother, and that became a recurring source of conflict. Coverage of the season describes Pattiya as having difficulty with Dylan's mother being extremely close to their lives, particularly because she was living nearby. From Dylan's perspective, his relationship with his mother was part of his existing life. From Pattiya's perspective, however, moving to a new country meant she was already making an enormous personal sacrifice. If the new life she was entering also involved feeling like a third person in her own relationship, that could become deeply frustrating. And this is where viewers should be careful. We cannot reduce the conflict to Pattiya hated Dylan's mother. That would be an oversimplification. The more accurate interpretation is that Pattiya and Dylan had different ideas about boundaries, family involvement, and what their life together should look like. That difference became especially important because Tasmania represented a completely different lifestyle from what Pattiya had known in Texas. Pattiya had built a life around her work and independence. Suddenly, she was expected to adapt to a smaller environment and a different pace of life. And the question became, was Pattiya really moving to Tasmania to create a life with Dylan, or was she being asked to fit into Dylan's already established life? That distinction is one of the underlying themes of their entire relationship story. Then there was money. The financial issue was not a minor subplot. It became one of the major sources of tension between Pattiya and Dylan. During the season, Dylan acknowledged that Pattiya's financial situation and debt affected his willingness to move forward with marriage. An episode summary specifically notes that Dylan finally admitted Pattiya's money troubles were a reason he had not proposed. For a couple already dealing with international relocation, financial concerns can become much more than arguments about spending. They can represent trust, responsibility, security, and the future. If one partner believes the other is financially unstable, marriage can suddenly feel risky. But if the other partner believes money is being used as a reason to delay commitment after 12 years together, resentment can build. This is where the emotional stakes became much higher. Pattiya had already invested years into the relationship. She had moved across the world. She had attempted to establish herself in a new environment. And yet Dylan was still worried about whether they were financially ready for marriage. From his perspective, that may have been practical. From hers, it could have felt like another obstacle in a relationship that had already spent years waiting for its next stage. That tension helps explain why the eventual breakup statement emphasized waiting. Pattiya's language suggested that the problem was not simply that she stopped loving Dylan. It was that she became exhausted by waiting for the relationship to become something more stable. That is a very different kind of heartbreak. Then came another major problem: trust. During the season and the tell-all period, Dylan raised concerns about Pattiya's work and interactions with other people. Reports from the tell-all coverage say Dylan accused Pattiya of cheating. Those accusations are important to mention, but they must be handled carefully. An accusation is not proof. There is no responsible reason to present an allegation as established fact unless it has been independently verified. What we can say is that trust became a serious issue within the relationship and was discussed publicly around the time of the tell-all. And that matters because long-distance relationships already require an unusual amount of trust. When two people spend significant periods apart, they cannot rely on physical proximity to reassure themselves. They have to communicate, they have to trust. And when trust begins to weaken, every unanswered question can become bigger. Every delayed message can feel suspicious. Every unexplained interaction can become an argument. Every disagreement can reopen old wounds. The couple's relationship had already experienced breakups and reconciliations over the years. That history could make trust even more complicated, because once a relationship has repeatedly broken apart and come back together, both partners may carry memories of previous instability into the next chapter, and then came the moment that appeared to signal a new beginning. Dylan proposed to Pattiya. The engagement happened during the season at Cataract Gorge Reserve, according to coverage of their relationship. For viewers, it looked like the relationship had survived the worst. After all the conflict, after the disagreements about Tasmania, money, family, and trust, they were engaged. Pattiya said yes. For a couple who had already spent more than a decade together, an engagement could have been interpreted as proof that the relationship had finally reached the destination they had been chasing. But an engagement does not automatically resolve the problems that existed before it. Sometimes an engagement raises the stakes. Suddenly, every unresolved issue becomes more serious. Marriage means shared finances, long-term living arrangements, legal commitments, family relationships, potential relocation decisions, and expectations about the future. So while the engagement looked like a happy ending on television, the underlying questions had not necessarily disappeared. Where would they live? Would Pattiya remain in Tasmania? Would Dylan eventually move? How would they handle family boundaries? What would happen with their careers? Then came the tell-all. And this is where viewers began to suspect that the engagement might not mean the story was settled. Pattiya revealed that she had moved back to America. That alone was significant. She had moved to Tasmania to be with Dylan. Now she was back in Texas. During the tell-all period, reports also noted that she was no longer wearing her engagement ring. But there was an even more revealing detail. Pattiya explained that living in a small town with Dylan's mother only minutes away was not going to work for them. That statement provided a window into the fundamental incompatibility that had been developing. Pattiya wasn't simply struggling with geography. She was struggling with the lifestyle. She had moved across the world expecting one kind of future. Instead, she found herself questioning whether that future was actually compatible with who she was. Dylan, meanwhile, had his own perspective. Reports from the tell-all coverage indicate that he believed Pattiya struggled with a simpler lifestyle in Tasmania. Again, both perspectives can exist simultaneously. Pattiya could genuinely love Dylan while genuinely disliking the life she was being asked to live. Dylan could genuinely love Pattiya while genuinely believing she needed to adapt to Tasmania. And sometimes those two realities cannot be reconciled. That is one of the painful truths of relationships. Love does not automatically make two lifestyles compatible, and then something happened that, in retrospect, makes the current breakup even more surprising. In February 2026, Pattiya and Dylan publicly indicated that they were still together. Reality TV World reported that Dylan posted photographs of himself and Pattiya, including images taken in Tasmania. Pattiya commented that they were still together, still engaged and happy. She described their relationship as real and suggested that what viewers had seen had included ups and downs. That update matters enormously, because it means that as recently as February 2026, the public record showed the couple presenting themselves as a functioning engaged pair. They had not simply disappeared from each other's lives. They had not publicly announced a breakup. They were actively telling fans that they were still together. So when Pattiya announced the breakup months later, the shock was understandable. For viewers who had followed their journey, the story seemed to have another chapter left. Maybe the relationship had finally stabilized. Maybe the couple had worked through their differences. Maybe the distance between Texas and Tasmania was becoming manageable. Maybe the engagement was still moving toward marriage. Those were reasonable assumptions based on what the couple themselves had publicly communicated. And that is why the August announcement hit differently. Then came August. Pattiya announced that the 12-year relationship had ended. Her message was emotional, but it was also remarkably